The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. 24th Day. While the order of preachers was evolving according to the plans of the lords of Tarsus, something terrible would happen in Spain. The return of Beret and Bishar. And that event almost meant, Dr. Signal, the end of the house of Tarsus. I will show now how occurred the facts. Remember, Doctor, that the ancient Onaba, the major city of the Tututni, was since the 8th century, under Arab dominance, who denominated it Elvi. In the year 1011, was the head of the Terafas kingdoms, being its first sovereign, Abu Zard Muhammad ibn Arib, followed by Abu Mazad ad-Dalates. But in 1051, was promptly annexed to the kingdom of Seville, until the year 1241. As I already explained, during those centuries of Arab occupation, the House of Tarsus survived without problems, and reached an enviable economic power. The village of Tuds, which existence depended, in the essential of the properties that the lords of Tarsus exploited in the region, had grown and prospered a lot, counting in the time with some 3.500 inhabitants. A part of the direct nucleus of the family Tarsus Velta, that lived in the Segnal residence, and was composed of some 50 members. In the village of Tuds, lived many families of the lineage of the House of Tarsus, but of collateral bloodliners. So, in the year 1128, when Beret and Bishar were celebrating the Galim Council of Mozone, the kingdom of Huelva was subordinated to the Tarifa of Seville. The king of Castile and Leon, Ferdinand III, the saint, reconquests Seville in 1248, but he died there in 1252. His son Alfonso X, the wise, ends the campaign, conquering in 1258 the Algarve and the regions of Huelva and Nigla. The king gave this region as dowry of his natural daughter Beatriz, who joined her to the crown of Portugal when she married with Alfonso III. As such annexation affected the ancient rights that the House of Tarsus had over the region, the crown of Portugal compensated the Knight Odilion of this Velta with the title of Count of Tarseville. In reality, the armorial achievement that Portugal gave to the House of Tarsus was engraved with the legend Condot Tarzegvel, with which was abbreviated the title of Count of Tarsus and Velta. The subsequent direct lecture ended to agglutinate the syllables of the abbreviation, and to form such word Tarseville, that identified the House of Tarsus in the next centuries. The design of the blazon was the product of a hard negotiation between Odilion and the Portuguese heralds, in which the new count imposed his perspective, appealing to difference in the language, and to a whimsical explanation of the requested emblems. Assuming that in the ancient Lusitania no one remembered the House of Tarsus, they claimed the printmarking of many familiar symbols in the armorial achievement, and they went accepting, in this manner, the presence of the rooster as representations of the Holy Spirit, in the left and right sides of the arms of Tarsus. The barbal unicorn, chimerical animal, has the symbol of the demon that surrounds the umbilicus of the House of Tarsus, and the fortress of the umbilicus is equivalent to the ancient property of the House of Tarsus. The rivers Odiel and Tinta as part of the country, and necessary to define the scene, etc. And, finally, they included the image of the wise sword, as expression of the lady, in the time the Virgin of the Grotto, to whom the Knights of this were consecrated. On the blade, the heralds engraved the war cry of the lords of Tarsus, Honoret Merti. The next king of Castile and Leon, Sancho IV, reintegrated the region of Huelva to the crown of Castile, and installed as Lord to Juan de Luna, but he assimilated the title and the arms of the House of Tarsus to that kingdom. As we will see right now, the county of Tarseville, victim of a great mortality years before, was feudalized by a Catalan knight, who had given rights of his rising Mediterranean county, in exchange of those further Andalusian shires. More than a century had elapsed since Beret and Bishar ordained the Galim to execute two missions: to comply with the extermination sentence of the Cathars, and to edify a Templar castle in Arasna. The first mission, as was seen, was carried out, with neatness by the sister Urshins Gleam. About the second, instead, was no advance yet. While Ferdinand III, the saint, reconquests Seville in 1248, his son Alfonso X, the wise seizes in 1258, the Algarve, and Huelva, and King Sancho II, of Portugal, a short time before his death in 1248, he conquered the Arasna region that passed to integrate the crown of Castile in 1252. It can be assumed, the urgency with which acted the Templars since the same moment in which Huelva was reconquered. In 1259, they had obtained a certification from Alfonso X that authorized them to occupy a property in the mountain range of Arasna, and to fortify it conveniently, for the effect to shelter and defend the garrison of 200 knights. However, a few years before the emission of such certification, the Templars had localized the cave at Vodil, once charted the plans and excavated the foundations of the castle. All the mountain range of Arasna remained under the Templar control, including the population of Arasna and many minor villages. But, the members of the chosen people, who accompanied the Templars in the enterprise, didn't come to an unknown place. The name of Arasna, in fact, comes from the Hebrew root eret, which means mountains, being Aranda, the mountainous, synonymous of Arasna. This curious etymology has nothing mysterious, if it is thought that the village was founded by the Jewish traders, who traveled with the Phoenicians, during the occupation of Harshish, 1,000 years before the actual age. Which later was called Arcelasis by Ptolemy, Arasna, by the Greeks, and Rieto, which resisted on it to the Roman legions, denominated it Arizena. For the Arabs, was Dadahazen, and, due to, horrible food that the Saracens made when the Christians took by surprise the village, the Moorish Arasna. Since 1259, were dispatched troops to Arasna, from many regions of Spain, and even France, by luck that during the construction remained 2,000 knights camped, assisted by 3,000 servant brothers. Such forces were distributed around the hills and performed a rigorous surveillance to avoid that the near-dwellers could get closer to watch the works. The Mates of Solomon, the Mason Guild controlled by the Cistercians, concurred to the request of Great Master due to, even if the Order of the Temple countered with their own division specialized in the military constructions, this fortress would have something different. In first place, it had to possess a great church, and in second term, that church would need to have a secret entrance communicated with its ships with the underground cave. So, it was indispensable, the assistance of the College of Temple Constructors. The college entrusted the edification of the church to the Master Pedro Milan. This one was authorized by the fiery Gleam Pope Alexander IV, the same who in those moments excommunicated Manfred of Swabia, and procured the extermination of the Obensdorfen, and the ruin of the Geiberlang party, to consecrate the church to the cult of the of Sorrows. Such dedication, of course, was not causal, but it obeyed to the Gleam plan of substituting to the Virgin of Agatha, the divine Atlantean mother of Neptune, for a Jewish Virgin Mary, who cried, distempered her heart of fire, due to the pain of the crucifixion of her son Jesus. The Virgin of Agatha, on the contrary, didn't cry, neither experienced any pain in her heart of ice, when his son of stone crucified himself, in the tree of terror, and died, but she rejoiced and shed her grace over the incarcerated spirits, because his son had died, as the bravest white warrior, who faced the illusion of the potencies of the matter. The celebration of the cult to the Virgin of Sorrows was instituted, as could not have been in other way, by the ineffable Gleam Pope Innocent III, when he introduced the sequence Stabat Mater, in the Mass of the Sorrows, the Friday of the Passion of Jesus Christ. The Master Pedro Milan raised, then, for the Templars, the Church of Our Lady of Sorrows, Patroness thence of Arasna, consecration that contrasted openly with the Virgin of the Grace, and Happiness, Our Lady of the Grotto, who was venerated in the neighboring Seigneury of Tharsis, or Tuds. when the temple was finished, was deposited in her altar the image of Our Lady of the Greatest Sorrow, which is still conserved, and received from Urban IV, the hierarchy of prelate, of the order of the temple. Simultaneously, was feverishly worked in the construction of the castle, elevated with the church, to 700 meters, fencing with walls and pits an adjacent area, of a mud Asia tower. 5 years later, the church and the castle were finished, and the surplus troops, as the contractors' brothers of Solomon, were withdrawing serenely from the zone. Nevertheless, would pass many years before the local villagers would dare to get closer to the hill of the castle of Arasna. But, that task was not all what the Templars undertook against the house of Tharsis, in those years. The castle of Arasna was an obligation imposed by the immortals, to which they'd given loyal accomplishment. Now they would wait patiently the return of Baray and Bishar, for make that the muset in their plans. But this patience didn't mean immobility. On the contrary, once reconquered the regions in power of the Arabs, the order launched a campaign of occupations in all the country of Huelva, either seating garrisons in fortress and rescued cities, or building new churches and fortifying areas. The distribution of those occupations would not occur arbitrarily, but it obeyed to a rigorous planification, which objectives never lost the necessity to surround the house of Tharsis, and conspire against the pact of blood. To remember only the most important sites of those deployments, it is worthy to mention the cession obtained over the convent St. Mary of La Rapida, in Pelos de la Frontera, in front of Huelva, from which I will talk again. Or the complete possession of Leppa, the ancient lecture of the Romans, situated 6 kilometers from Queteria, with the clear purpose to control the mouth in the river Pedrus, from where they spest that the lords of Tharsis could navigate secretly. Or the suspicious interest to reside in the insignificant Trigueros, 25 kilometers from Valdevat del Camino, very near to Tours, where they constructed a parochial church that still exists, is due to Trigueros, ancient Roman population, is nestled in the middle of a fertile and extensive campaign which constituted in remote times the heart of the Iberian Tartessos. On its fields were wisely disseminated tens of dolmens and menhirs, heritage of the Pact of Blood, that the Templars were dedicated in those days to destroy prelixly. Only one dolmen was saved in the village de Soto, that can be visited today, due to the Lords Moyano de la Serrat, of the blood of Tharsis, and traditional candy and honey makers, prevented the Knights of Satan to fulfill their infamous mission. The village de Soto is located 5 kilometers from Trigueros, and the dolmen is in the cave of Saint Saran de Soto. In the house of Tharsis, as is logic, such movements not passed unnoticed and obeyed to the lords of Tharsis to take some precautions. They fortified also the village of Tours, and the seigneurial residence, because they believed that the Gleam were preparing to outbreak a crusade against them, claiming some heresy, perhaps denouncing the cult of the Virgin of the Grotto, and placed themselves in the area of force of 500 Almogavars, and 50 knights, that was the maximum permitted to arm the Count of Tarseville, for other purposes that were not reconquest. Unfortunately, nothing of these would be necessary, but the lords of Tharsis didn't achieve, once again, to prevent the diabolic plans of Baray and Bishar. To all this, you will wonder, Dr. Sentinel, what happened with the wise sword, since the day in which Tartessos fell and the Vrayas occulted it in the secret cavern? The answer is simple. It remained in the cavern all the time, that's to say, for some 1,700 years, until this moment. It was carried out, in this manner, the vow that the men of stone made. The wise sword would not be exposed at the light of the day again until the opportunity to leave not appears, until a future man of stone could see reflected on the stone of Venus the lithic sign of Queteria. For it, the lords of Tharsis established that a god had to remain perpetually with the wise sword, what was not always possible due to only a few initiates were able to enter in the secret cavern. As you will remember, Doctor, the secret entrance was sealed by the runes of Neptune, since the age of the White Atlantans, and resulted impossible to localize it, by anyone who was not a Hyperborean initiate, that's to say, initiated in the mystery of the pure blood, by the men of stone, by the wise warriors. However, except for a few and obscure periods, the House of Tharsis never stopped to produce initiates capable to perform the guard of the wise sword. But they were not such numerous as in the times of Tartessos, when the cult of the cold fire was practiced at the light of the moon and existed a college of hierophants. In the next centuries, it had to be occulted the truth of the cold fire, to the Romans, Visigoths, Arabs, and Catholics, being reduced the celebration of the cult to the strictly familiar ambit. Even inside of such reserved familiar ambit, it had to be called only those who demonstrated a convenient Gnostic predisposition to face the test of the cold fire, which in nothing had changed and continued being as terrifying and mortal as before. Except for those periods that I have mentioned, during which no member of the House of Tharsis was capable to enter in the secret cavern, the usual was the minimum formation of 2 initiates by century, in the worst ages, and of 5 or 6 in the most proliferate. If the initiate was a lady of Tharsis, was given to her the title of Freya, in remembrance of the Iberian guardians. If he was about a knight, he was called Noio, which had been the name, according to the white Atlantans, of the Hyperborean pontifex that in the Atlantis guarded the Ark. It means, the basal stone, of the infinite stairway, that they knew to build, and that guided to the origin. It is obvious that, to comply with the vow of the men of stone, the Noios and Freyas had to become in hermits, that's to say, they had to dwell in the secret cavern, and remain all the possible time with the wise sword. And no one could serve them because nobody, but them, could enter in the abode. But such loneliness lacked of importance for the initiates. The renounce and the sacrifice that demanded the function of guardian of the wise sword was considered a high honor to the lords of Tharsis. According to what was referred, by who had entered and departed from the secret cavern, the work realized for many centuries by the initiates that remained there had gifted the sight of some Amenetites. In fact, even though in the beginning was agreed to not introduce cultural objects, the truth is that the Noios and Freyas were carving patiently the stone of the cavern, and modeled chairs, tables, beds, altar, and our representation of the goddess of the cold fire. And in front of the countenance of Pyrene, burned once again the flame of the perennial lamp. But the countenance of the goddess not emerged this time from among her, but was sculpted over a giant green stalagmite. Neither existed a mechanism to open the eyes, because they had been deeply excavated and were always opened, ready to reveal to the initiates the infinite blackness of themselves. In front of the countenance was the altar, which consisted of a cubic column topped by 2 echelons. The surface of the superior echelon reached to the chin of the goddess, and, over it, was a vertical hole in which was introduced the hilt of the wise sword up to the quion, in such manner that the same remained straight and aligned with the nose of the goddess, as if it were an axis of symmetry of the countenance. Thus, the stone of Venus, that was crimped in the cross-guard of the hilt, appeared in the center of the scene, disposed for the contemplation. In the surface of the bottom echelon, under the level of the hilt, was placed the perennial lamp. Such section of the secret cavern had form of semi-spherical nave, being the stalagmite with the countenance of Pyrene, in a near extreme to the wall of the stone. This appeared gushed of lava and salts, while in the roof was presented bristly of greenish stalactites. The floor, on the contrary, had been carefully cleaned from protuberances and leveled, in such manner that it was possible to put comfortably in front of the countenance of the goddess, and contemplate, as well, the perennial lamp, and the wise sword with the stone of Venus. The necessary nourishment to subsist was provided by the lords of Tharsis, maintaining always filled the pantry of a chapel that existed at the foot of Hill Condelaria. Such chapel, that had been constructed to the indicated purposes, remained locked most of the year, and was only visited by the lords of Tharsis, who went there to pray in the major loneliness. Therefore, they took advantage of it, to deposit the victuals in a small hind quarter, which unique door guided to the hillside. The initiates descended there furtively, in night preferably, many times in the year, to provide themselves of food. Normally, they found a sumpter in the adjoining farmyard, which they used to carry the lumps up to the secret entrance and that they liberated later, because the animal returned meekly to the hedge. But in other opportunities the lords of Tharsis awaited in the chapel entire weeks, until they coincided in some of those nocturnal visits. Then, in the middle of the joyous reunion, the Noyos and Reyes received news from the house of Tharsis. Specially, they inquired about the young members of the family, if one of them prepared seriously for the test of the cold fire, and if they noticed possibilities that he could overcome it. Nothing worried more to the men of stone and caliber ladies than to not be replaced by other initiates, that the wise sword remained without custody. The lords of Tharsis, by their part, inquired to Noyos and Reyes about the mystical visions. The lithic sign of the Katraba has not manifested yet. Have they received a message from the liberator gods? When, O gods? When would come the day of the final battle? When, the total war against the potencies of the matter? When would they abandon the infernal universe? When the origin? It always occurred in a similar form until then. Because since the castle of Arasna was finished, some tens of kilometers from the hill Condil area, a threat halo seemed to be spread through the entire region. Was necessary then, to extreme the precaution measures to supply the secret cavern, and were reduced to minimum the meetings with the hermits initiates. In the time, dwelled in the secret cavern 3 initiates. An old Freya, woman of more than 70 years, who, for 50 years, never abandoned the guard. A Noyo, of 50 years, Naso de Tharsis, who, until the 30 years, was a presbyter in the church Our Lady of the Grotto, and now, was officially dead. And a young Noyo, of 32 years old, Gode of Tharsis, who realized the function to supply the secret cavern. But Gode, son of the Count Odilon, of Tarseville, was not an improvised in risk issues. Taken since he was a child to Sicily, by one of the Aragonese Kenists, who served in the court of Frederick II, he was a page in the palace of Palermo, and then shield-bearer of a Teutonic knight, in Holy Land. Named knight, as well at his 20 years, he entered to the order of Teutonic Knights, and fought for 5 years, in the conquest of Prussia. Since 7 years ago, he was in the guard of the secret cavern, although he passed for being still fighting in the north of Germany. He was an expert warrior, who knew how to move with precision in the battlefield. His incursions in the chapel were carefully studied, seeking to not be discovered by the enemy. I clarify this, to discard the case that this negligence was the responsible of what occurred later. The truth is that the enemy knew such place, and this was not ignored by the members of the House of Tharsis. According to the familiar saga, indeed, in the place where was the chapel of the hill Condil area, the immortals Bray and Bishar had killed the Vrayas 1,700 years before. Since then the lords of Tharsis thought to change the provisioning point, but the intense surveillance that they maintained in Arasna not revealed any movement in direction to the chapel, and all remained as this for the next 4 years. Every 3 or 4 months the Noyo Gode descended from the mountain range by surprise and unpredictable, and proceeded to transport the provisions to the secret cavern, and only once a year he established contact with some of the lords of Tharsis. But the news were invariably the same. The Templars didn't effectuate any movement in such direction. But, even if they not acted now, they were there, very close, and their presence constituted a threat that was perceived in the atmosphere. Naturally, the Templars didn't act because they were waiting the immortals. And they finally reached 140 years after the murder of Lupo of Tharsis in the fortress Demozone. A ship of the Templar army, coming from Normandy, landed in Lisbon in 1268, with the abbot of Clairvaux, the great master of the temple, and a custody of 15 knights. The great master explained to the Queen Beatrice that the expedition had for destiny the castle of Arasna, where would be named a provincial, obtaining all her support and the subsequent authorization of King Alfonso III. the presence of Beret and Bishar was not noticed there, because they simulated to be servant brothers and were dressed like them. Days after, the travelers took the ancient Roman road, which started in Elizapa, Lisbon, and Hispales, Seville, and passed through Cartagena, a few kilometers from Arasna. Once in Arasna, the immortals approved all what the Templar did, referring to the edification of the castle. In the interior of the church, the floor of the apse was the trapdoor that connected with the cave of Odile. In reality, the cave was not exactly under the church, but it was necessary to reach to it by a ramp tunnel, which access was in a wood stairway in the apse. But Beret and Bishar overlooked the details of the construction, because their major interest was focused in the cave. They explored it, inch by inch, for hours, speaking each other in a strange language that their four accompanists didn't dare to interrupt. They were the abbot of Clairvaux, the great master of the temple, both Gelims, and two Templar preceptors, experts in Hebrew language. It means, two rabbis, representatives of the chosen people. Apparently, the inspection had positive results that they divined by the expressions of the immortals, because they were extremely serious in all what referred to the cave and their presence there. In any case, they only made one request: the adaptation to some symbolic form, which they described with precision, the mirror of a small underground lake, which was fed by a trickle of minimum volume. Also, such affluent had to be momentarily interrupted, diverting the eroded watercourse of alimentation. And in certain places, had to be distributed, around the lake, 7 menorah candelabras,